Imagine waking up in a freezing stone chamber. No fire crackling, no soft bed, just a thin layer of straw beneath you. Your breath forms icy clouds in the pitch-black darkness. Rats scurry around your feet, feasting on crumbs, and worse. The stench of unwashed bodies, human waste, and mold clings to every corner. Outside, the howls of wolves echo through the night, mixing with the distant screams of the sick and the cries of guards on patrol. But the real terror isn't just outside the walls. It's what lurks inside. Disease spreads like wildfire in these crowded halls, and one wrong move could mean death, whether from starvation, freezing, a surprise attack, or a secret betrayal from within. In medieval castles, nightfall wasn't rest. It was a battle to survive. How did people endure freezing temperatures, the ever-present threat of fire, vermin infestation, and hostile enemies waiting for the perfect moment to strike? And what dark rituals or desperate measures did they resort to when the cold, the fear, and the silence became unbearable? Let's step into the shadows of these stone fortresses to uncover the brutal, shocking truths of life after dark in a medieval castle, where every night was a test of endurance and survival was never guaranteed. Welcome to the History Survivalist. Stone walls, frozen nights. You thought castles were cozy? Think again. You wouldn't survive one night in a medieval castle, and here's why. Those towering stone walls that look so majestic today? In winter, they turned into massive freezers. Unlike wood, stone holds the cold, and it held it deep. Once the temperature dropped, it didn't just seep in. It stayed. It clung to the walls, the floor, even your breath. There was no insulation, no heating system, just solid stone, cold, unforgiving, and everywhere. Unless you were among the privileged few with a fireplace, your room was nothing more than a stone box. And if you were a servant or guard, you didn't even get a room. You slept near doorways or tucked into stairwells, where the chill was sharpest. Fires weren't scattered throughout the castle. They were rare and shared, which meant most people didn't sleep. They simply endured, and the cold always won. And just when your body started to go numb, the real dangers of nightfall were only beginning. Limited lighting. When night fell over a medieval castle, darkness took control and ruled the halls. There were no torches lining every hallway, no warm glow spilling from every room. Just a few precious candles or oil lamps, rationed carefully because wax and oil were expensive. So when the sun went down, most of the castle was swallowed by shadow. Picture this. You're walking through cold stone corridors, guided only by memory, feeling your way along the walls. If you were lucky, you had a dim lantern. If not, you relied on the fading glow of the hearth, or the moonlight seeping through narrow windows. A single candle might be shared by an entire room. Guards, servants, even nobles moved slowly, quietly. One wrong step in the dark could mean a broken limb, or worse. And then there were the shadows, the way they danced across the walls, the way they turned simple shapes into monsters. In a world steeped in superstition, every creak and whisper after dark felt like a sign. The line between real and imagined blurred fast. In medieval castles, darkness wasn't just the absence of light, it was fuel for fear. Disease and vermin. You might think castles were safe, fortresses of stone built to keep the enemy out. But in the dead of night, it wasn't the army at your gates you had to fear. It was what was already inside. Because sometimes the most dangerous enemy was in your bed. In a medieval castle, disease didn't arrive with a warning. It crept in with the rats. It rode in on fleas, whispered through coughs, and scurried through shadows on the floor. And once it was in, there was nowhere to hide. Castles were packed, hundreds of people jammed into tight quarters, servants in stuffy dormitories, noble families crammed into shared rooms, visitors sleeping shoulder to shoulder in the halls. There was no fresh air, just the thick, sour stench of sweat, sickness, and bodies that hadn't bathed in weeks. Because baths? That was a risk. People believed hot water opened the pores and let illness in, so they avoided it. Instead, they wore layers. They wore their clothes for days, then weeks, until the wool was crawling with lice and their skin blistered with sores. The smell? Let's just say it lingered. But the worst part? It moved. Rats gnawed through floorboards. Mice tunneled through rushes on the ground. Fleas nested in your bedding and fed while you slept. Every scratch, every bite, every breath could be the start of the end. And then came the plague. In the 14th century, fleas riding rats brought the Black Death to castle doors. Once inside, it spread like wildfire. One infected person meant doom for the entire household. There was no cure, only prayers, superstition, and fear. People burned bundles of herbs trying to cleanse the air. But you can't cure infection with a good smell, not when the walls themselves were crawling with life too small to see, not when the straw you slept on hid the very thing that could kill you. In the end, those great stone castles didn't protect you. They trapped you, because in a medieval castle, the deadliest killers were already inside. Limited sanitation. When nature called in a medieval castle, there was no such thing as privacy or plumbing. Forget bathrooms. At night, most people grabbed a chamber pot, a basic bowl tucked beside the bed, and hoped for the best. In the morning, that pot was dumped, sometimes right out a window, into the courtyard or into the moat. The smell? Absolutely everywhere. If you were lucky or noble, you had access to a garderobe. These were primitive toilets, narrow stone closets built into castle walls, with a wooden seat and a hole that dropped straight down. Into pits, or sometimes rivers. Sounds clever until you realize you're perched over a freezing draft in the dead of winter, your backside dangling in the wind. Many said, "No thank you," and stuck with the pot. And the smell didn't stay in the garderobe. It seeped into the stone, into the rushes on the floor, those straw mats meant to soak up spills, scraps, and whatever else dropped during the day. No mops, no bleach, just new straw dumped on top of the old when things got too bad to ignore. Servants were the unlucky ones cleaning it all, hauling waste, scrubbing pits, or shoveling out garderobes. It was thankless, smelly, and dangerous work. But without them, the whole castle would drown in its own filth. Beneath the grand banners and cold stone towers, medieval castles hid a filthy truth. When night fell, things got disgusting fast. Sleeping arrangements. Forget the movie scenes with private chambers and velvet curtains. In reality, medieval castles were packed wall to wall with life, noisy, crowded, and constantly in motion. Once night fell in a medieval castle, sleep was a group activity. Nobles, servants, guards, cooks, even visiting knights, they all lived on top of each other. Privacy? Practically a myth. Servants often slept on the floor of their lord's chamber or tucked away behind heavy curtains. Even noble families shared rooms, sometimes squeezing in honored guests too. And when the sun went down, the great hall turned into a medieval sleepover. Straw pallets were scattered across the stone floor. Pages curled up by the dying hearth. Guards dozed near doorways, swords within reach. Snores echoed off the walls. Footsteps creaked. Somewhere in the dark, a watchman's armor clinked as he made his rounds. It wasn't comfort, it was survival. Sleeping close together helped conserve heat, and with so many people in one space, no one was ever far from help or interruption. You didn't wander through dark halls alone if nature called, but you also didn't get silence or space or anything resembling rest. Beds were often shared, sometimes with strangers. Every movement had a witness, every sound had an audience. And if you were lucky enough to claim a warm corner, you defended it with blankets and elbows. In a world where castles promised protection from outside threats, the real challenge was inside, trying to find sleep in a room full of bodies, noise, and the smell of daily survival. Clothing. In a medieval castle, Your clothes were your armor against the cold. There were no pajamas, no changing into something cozy before bed. What you wore during the day? You kept it on. Tunics, cloaks, boots, everything stayed, because taking them off meant losing precious warmth. Wool was the material of choice, not because it was soft, but because it worked. It held heat, shed moisture, and stayed warm even when damp. At night, people wrapped themselves in every scrap they owned. Shoes were stuffed with moss or straw to stop toes from freezing. And heads? Always covered. A bare scalp meant lost heat, so nightcaps weren't quaint. They were survival gear. You'd look more like a wrapped-up traveler than someone ready for sleep. In the bitter silence of stone-walled rooms, clothing was your final defense. It wasn't stylish, it wasn't soft, but it might just keep you alive until morning. Central hearths. In a medieval castle, the hearth wasn't just a fireplace, it was life or death. When night fell and the cold crept in through stone walls, people huddled in the great hall. At its center, a roaring fire, the castle's only true source of warmth. Everything happened here: meals, meetings, even moments of sleep stolen beside the flames. But staying warm came at a cost. There were no chimneys, just smoke curling through rafters and slipping out through ceiling vents. The air stung your eyes. Breathing felt like inhaling ash. Still, no one complained. Without that fire, the cold could kill. Only those nearest the hearth felt its heat. The rest sat in shadows, cloaks pulled tight, hands outstretched toward a warmth that barely reached them. And yet, the hearth was more than survival. It was the castle's beating heart, a place where stories were told, bread was broken, and silence was shared in the flickering dark. In a world without central heating, it wasn't comfort they chased. It was survival. And the hearth was their only chance. Dark rituals and desperate measures. As night deepened, the cold crept into every stone crack, chilling bones and breaking spirits. But it wasn't just the freezing air or the ever-looming threat of attack that haunted those inside the castle walls. It was the silence and the shadows that seemed to whisper from every dark corner. In these long, merciless nights, fear could grip even the bravest heart. Desperation set in, and the people of the castle often turned to strange, eerie rituals to keep the darkness, and something far worse, at bay. One such practice was the lighting of protective fires and the burning of pungent herbs like sage, rosemary, and juniper. The smoke was believed to cleanse not just the air, but also to ward off evil spirits and malevolent forces. These rituals were a mix of superstition and survival, a fragile hope that scent and flame could repel death itself. But when superstition wasn't enough, people resorted to more desperate measures. Some carried charms or amulets, small tokens blessed by priests or infused with folklore magic, believing these could shield them from curses, disease, or even the devil's grasp. Mothers whispered prayers over their children, clutching crosses tightly, while guards muttered invocations to saints as they paced the battlements. Then there was the silence itself. In the dead of night, every creak and groan of the castle seemed amplified, a door shifting in the wind, a rat scratching beneath the floorboards. Paranoia ran rampant. It wasn't uncommon for men to take turns keeping vigil, chanting prayers or recounting stories to drown out the oppressive quiet. When cold became unbearable and warmth impossible to find, some cast themselves into physical endurance tests, wrapping in furs and layering every piece of clothing, moving constantly to keep blood flowing. Yet others had no choice but to endure in freezing stillness, biting down on cloth or holding their breath to stave off shivers. In the darkest moments, despair led some to desperate acts. There are accounts of people lighting small fires beneath their beds, dangerous and forbidden, but a brief blazing comfort against the chill. Others would gather close, sharing body heat in cramped chambers, forging fragile bonds in shared suffering. And when hunger gnawed at them and hope flickered low, the castle's occupants sometimes turned to faith, and sacrifice. Holy relics were brought out for blessing. Prayers were offered not just for protection, but for mercy in a world that seemed endlessly cruel after nightfall. These rituals and acts of desperation reveal a startling truth. Medieval nights in castles weren't just about survival of the body. They were survival of the mind and spirit, clinging to light, to faith, and to each other in the face of a dark, unyielding world. Water supply and wells. Imagine being trapped inside a medieval castle under siege. The enemy presses close, the air thick with tension, but beyond arrows and battering rams, another enemy waits silently. Thirst. Water was life inside a castle, yet securing it was no simple task. Unlike today, castles had no running taps or fountains. Instead, they relied on carefully guarded wells and clever water storage to keep their people alive through long, desperate months. Most castles had a deep well carved right inside their walls, a lifeline sunk into the earth, sometimes hundreds of feet deep. Pulling water up was backbreaking work, done by hand with ropes and buckets. But this well wasn't just a convenience, it was a fortress within a fortress, protected by thick stone and locked gates. If the well was lost or poisoned, survival became almost impossible. Rainwater collection was another vital strategy. Castles were designed with sloping roofs and gutters leading into large cisterns, massive tanks carved underground or inside walls. These caught every precious drop from the skies, storing it carefully for dry spells or emergencies. Yet water inside a castle could also be a source of danger. Wells and cisterns were vulnerable to contamination from decaying food, human waste, or worse, enemy sabotage. Guards often patrolled these sources vigilantly, ensuring no poison or debris found its way into the lifeblood of the castle. During a siege, fetching water was a nerve-wracking task. Sending servants or soldiers down to the well or to secret springs outside the walls risked deadly ambush. Every drop mattered, rationed carefully to keep both people and animals alive. The castle's designers even included hidden water passages or tunnels, allowing secret water access points known only to the defenders. These could mean the difference between life and death, allowing a trickle of hope to flow beneath the siege's shadow. Inside the cold stone walls, water shaped every decision. It governed how long a castle could hold out, how food was prepared, and even how sanitation was managed. The presence of fresh water wasn't just a convenience, it was the heartbeat of survival. So next time you picture a medieval castle, remember beneath the towering walls and soaring battlements, the true fortress was often the well, quiet, deep, and essential, holding the power to save or doom those trapped inside. Kitchen. In a freezing medieval castle, survival often started in one place, the kitchen. Far from the main hall, tucked into stone annexes or outbuildings, the kitchen was more than a cooking space. It was a furnace of life, and it never slept. Massive hearths burned day and night. Spit-roasted meat crackled over open flames. Stews simmered in iron cauldrons. Bread baked in ovens so hot, the stone walls around them sweated. But this wasn't comfort. It was necessity. Food meant fuel. Calories became warmth. Hot soup wasn't just a meal. It was a weapon against the cold. Cooks toiled in the smoke and ash, working bare-handed in blazing heat while the rest of the castle froze. There were no breaks, no room for mistakes. Fire was both their tool and their threat. Some castles even carried heated stones from the kitchen to sleeping chambers just to stave off the frostbite creeping in from the walls. In smaller keeps, a single fire cooked and warmed, but in great fortresses, the kitchen was the engine room of survival, feeding dozens, sometimes hundreds, and offering the only hint of warmth beyond the great hall. And when night fell and the castle slipped into darkness, one place still flickered with life. You could smell it, hear it, and feel it. Because as long as the kitchen burned, so did hope. Night watches. When night fell on a medieval castle, silence didn't mean safety. It meant danger was just harder to hear. As the last torch was lit and the drawbridge slammed shut, a new kind of battle began, not against armies, but against the dark itself. While nobles huddled under furs and servants curled on straw, the night guards stayed on their feet, cold, armed, and afraid. They patrolled stone corridors where their own footsteps echoed like intruders. They climbed spiral staircases that creaked with every shift. Outside, in the misty courtyards and shadowy ramparts, wind howled like wolves. The gates were sealed, portcullises locked. From dusk till dawn, nothing went in or out unseen. Every crackle, clatter, or distant bark could mean an ambush or just the wind. The guards had to know the difference. But enemies weren't just human. Fire was a constant threat. One spark in a storeroom could turn the castle into an oven. So guards sniffed the air for smoke, listened for the telltale hiss of burning wood, and ran for water before the blaze could spread. Each man had a post, some near noble chambers, others on the battlements or by the stairs. They rotated in brutal shifts, wrapped in cloaks, gripping spears or swords, eyes stinging from cold and fatigue. Falling asleep was not an option. One moment of rest could mean death, for them and everyone else. Because in the quiet of the castle night, you weren't just watching for intruders. You were guarding against the unknown, against betrayal, against the cold, the fire, and the shadows themselves. The night watch wasn't just a duty, it was a gamble. And the cost of failure? Everything. Siege warfare tactics against castles. Picture this. A massive army encircles a towering stone castle, banners snapping in the cold wind. The defenders inside brace themselves, knowing that what's coming won't be a quick battle, but a grinding siege that could last weeks, even months. Sieges were the ultimate test of medieval warfare, a brutal chess match where attackers and defenders each sought an edge. But how did armies try to break through walls built to resist arrows, fire, and even cannonballs? The first tactic was starvation. Attackers would surround the castle completely, cutting off supplies of food and fresh water. The goal? To wear down the defenders slowly, turning hunger and desperation into surrender. Inside the walls, every crumb counted, every drop of water was rationed like gold. But starvation wasn't the only weapon. Armies brought siege engines, massive, terrifying machines designed to batter stone walls or launch deadly projectiles. The trebuchet, a giant catapult powered by counterweights, could hurl huge stones, firepots, or even diseased carcasses over walls to break morale and spread sickness. Then came the battering ram, a huge wooden beam swung against gates or walls to break them down. Soldiers protected by wooden sheds, called tortoises, would push the ram forward, inch by agonizing inch, under a hail of arrows and boiling oil from above. Attackers also tried sapping, digging tunnels beneath castle walls to collapse them. It was dangerous work, requiring stealth and skill. Defenders, in turn, tried to detect these tunnels by listening carefully or digging counter-tunnels to intercept and fight the enemy underground. Sometimes attackers resorted to psychological warfare, sending messengers with threats or promises, trying to convince defenders to surrender without a fight. But the bravest defenders stood firm, knowing that every moment held the chance for reinforcements or a sudden turn in fortune. Inside the castle, defenders prepared for every assault. Archers lined the walls, ready to rain arrows down on anyone foolish enough to approach. Boiling oil and rocks awaited beneath murder holes to crush climbing invaders. Every loophole, every crenel, was a carefully crafted killing zone. Yet the siege wasn't just about brute force, it was a test of endurance, wit, and willpower. Attackers had to keep morale high and prevent disease and starvation from decimating their own ranks. Defenders clung to hope, fighting not just for a fortress, but for their lives and honor. In the end, a siege could end in many ways. The walls might fall, the gates could be breached, or starvation could force surrender. But whether by sword, starvation, or sheer stubbornness, the battle for a castle was as much a struggle of minds as it was of muscle. So when you think of medieval castles, remember this. Beneath their stone faces lay a deadly stage for epic struggles, a place where siege warfare tested the limits of human endurance, creativity, and courage. Bergfried Towers. If you were trapped in a besieged medieval castle, your last hope wasn't the drawbridge or the gatehouse, it was the Bergfried. These towering stone structures weren't built for beauty. They were engineered for endurance. Located at the heart or highest point of the castle, the Bergfried was the final redoubt, the ultimate fallback when every other wall was breached. Unlike the living quarters or halls, Bergfrieds were cold, narrow, and defensively brutal. Their walls could be over 10 feet thick. Staircases spiraled tightly, designed to favor defenders wielding weapons in their right hand. Windows were small slits, barely wide enough to shoot arrows from. Entryways were few and often accessible only by ladders or removable stairs that could be destroyed to slow attackers. In times of peace, the Bergfried stood quiet. It stored weapons, grain, or even valuables. But in crisis, it transformed. Nobles, soldiers, and sometimes even servants retreated inside with just enough food and water to survive days or weeks under siege. Defending the Bergfried was a grim business. Oil and rocks were heated and dropped through murder holes onto invaders below. Archers used the narrow openings to fire on enemies while remaining nearly impossible to hit. Every inch of the tower was designed for tactical advantage, yet life inside was miserable. It was dark, damp, and suffocating. Smoke from torches choked the air. Sanitation was almost non-existent. Hunger gnawed as supplies dwindled. But it offered one thing nowhere else in the castle could: time. Time to outlast an enemy. Time to wait for reinforcements. Time to survive. When everything else failed, when the walls fell and the courtyard was overrun, the Bergfried remained, silent, towering, and defiant. For many, it was the final shield between life and death. So, could you survive just one night in a medieval castle? Drop your answer in the comments. We'd love to hear your take, and if you want more immersive stories from the past, make sure to subscribe and ring that bell. We've got plenty more untold tales coming your way. Thanks for watching, and remember, history wasn't always heroic. Sometimes it was just about surviving the night.